500 years, that is how long it takes to understand what you had before you lost it. Most people never get the chance to understand that. Most people lose things and carry the losing forward into whatever comes next, without the specific mercy of being shown what the carrying could have been avoided. Mark Grayson was not most people. He was given something that no one in the history of anything had ever been given, the second version of the first chance. He woke up in a crib with 500 years pressing against them. Inside of a skull that had been alive for weeks. The disorientation lasted exactly 3 seconds, 3 seconds in which the mercy of maybe it is a dream was available, and then gone. Replaced by something that was not mercy, but was the only thing available. After mercy left, certainty, he was back, the wars were back, the losses were back. Every single person he had watched die in the 500 years of being what the universe had decided he needed to be, every single one of them, back in the specific way that the dead were back. When you remembered them, which was present, without being there, vivid without being real, he looked up at Debbie, young Debbie, Debbie who was still whole, who had not yet been broken by the specific thing that was going to try to break her. He looked up at her, from the body that could not yet hold its own weight, and made the only promise that 500 years of everything had left him, with the capacity to make, not this time, not one of them, not a single one. The plan was not complicated. The plan was simply knowledge, applied carefully to a timeline that he had already walked through once, and knew every step of, including the steps that had cost things that could not be replaced. He started with Nolan, because Nolan was the beginning of everything, both the good and the catastrophic, and beginnings, if you caught them early enough, were the most available things to change a 5-year-old. Philosophizing about the value of life over cereal while cartoons played in the background was not suspicious, was charming, was the kind of thing that adults smiled at, filed as precocious, and forgot. Nolan smiled, filed it, forgot it, or thought he did. The seeds Mark was planting did not need to be remembered consciously. They needed to be present in the back of a mind when the moment came that required them to be present. That was all, that was enough. The powers came early, earlier than the first time, because the body was young, but the awareness driving it was not young, had not been young in a very long time. He hid them because he knew exactly what Nolan did when he found out, and he was not ready for what Nolan did when he found out. Not yet. He trained instead in the spaces between everything else. Remote locations, late nights, the grinding unglamorous work of someone who was not building something new, was rebuilding something old, in a body that had not yet caught up to what was being asked of it. Cecil came next, because Cecil was the second piece of the infrastructure that what was coming required. He gave Cecil exactly enough, not everything, exactly enough to earn the specific kind of trust that Cecil extended to very few people, the trust that came with resources, with access, with the backing of someone who had been preparing for the worst for long enough that the preparation had become an institution. They trained together in rooms that did not exist, on paper that was not filed, while Nolan ate dinner with his family 3 floors above, completely unaware that the person across the table from him was running a decades-long operation in his own house, against him. For him, the distinction mattered. The distinction was everything. A villain attacked, and Mark had no choice. He stepped in publicly, and Nolan watched the footage, and the switch flipped, the way Mark had known it would flip, the moment he had been running the operation against human and Viltrumite DNA, compatible, Earth viable, the Guardians, a problem. Mark was in the building before Nolan arrived. He told the Guardians everything, in the specific, flat, urgent way of someone who did not have time for the convincing that the information required before it could be believed. They believed him, or believed enough of him to be ready when the doors came apart and Omni-Man was there, looking at a room that was supposed to be surprised, and was not. The fight was not the fight of the original timeline, was not the brutal one-sided demonstration of what the gap between Viltrumite capability and everything else looked like up close. It was a fight, a genuine one, between father and a son who had 500 years of experience in an 18-year-old body, and had spent the last several years training specifically for this moment, with a man who had been preparing for the worst his entire career. Mark parried and talked because the talking was the point, the hitting was the medium through which the talking was delivered. He told Nolan the future, not as a warning, as a weight, the specific weight of lived experience, that could not be argued with because it was not an argument, it was the truth, in the specific form that truth took when the person delivering it had paid for it. In full, he told him about the wars, about what Viltrumite supremacy cost, not in abstract terms, in faces, in names, in the specific shape of what regret looked like after 500 years of carrying it, in a body that refused to let you stop carrying it by simply ending. Nolan heard it in the way that you heard things, that you had been almost believing for a long time and had finally been given, the thing that made almost become completely. He hesitated. And in the hesitation, something cracked, not enough to fix anything, not immediately, but the crack was there, and cracks, given time, became something larger. He left. Mark let him go because the redemption arc still needed space to happen, and space was what Mark was giving it by not chasing, by faking the injury, by standing in the wreckage of a fight that had ended without anyone dying, and understanding that not dying was the victory, regardless of everything else. The Guardians were alive, all of them. Cecil spun the story. Deep space mission, protecting Earth from things too large for Earth to see. Debbie believed it because she wanted to, because the alternative to believing it was the truth. And the truth was something Mark had decided. She did not need to carry, not this version of it, not the version with thousands of bodies, and a city reduced to something that took years to rebuild. She was heartbroken. Mark had known she would be heartbroken, had chosen it anyway, because heartbroken healed. The other things did not fully, not in one lifetime. He went to Eve directly, without the detour, without the years of amber that had cost him time he did not have to spend on something that was not where he was going anyway. Eve became his partner in the truest sense of the word, the sense that meant not just the person you were with, but the person you were with when the being with required everything. And she gave everything because that was Eve, had always been Eve, in every version of every timeline that contained her, Angstrom Levy, before the accident, before the machine. Before the thing that took a complicated man and made him a simple monster. Mark found him there, in the before, and said the things that the before made available, that the after would have made impossible. He stabilized the technology, saved the life, recruited the mind, and Angstrom Levy, who had been the source of one of the worst things that had ever happened in the original timeline, became instead one of the most important things that had ever happened. In this one, the Invincible War, the invasion of evil variants, the countless versions of Mark, from countless broken timelines pouring into a world that had no framework for what was pouring into it, all of it gone because of one conversation with a man who had not yet become the thing he had become in a world where no one came early enough. Thraxa, Mark arrived stronger than Nolan had been at the start of everything. He ended the fight fast, one strike for Thula, casualties minimized, a deliberate loss for Lucan, precisely wrong, precisely enough to let the Viltrumites take Nolan, exactly as the plan required. Oliver came home in his arms, small and completely unaware of what he was going to become, under the specific training of a brother who knew exactly what Oliver was capable of, and intended to make sure every bit of it was ready before it was needed. Mark sat through the family dinner with the specific patience of someone who had 500 years of practice sitting through things that deserved better responses than the ones available, and smiled, because smiling was available and was better than the alternative he provoked. Anissa deliberately, methodically, made sure the Empire received the message, in the clearest possible terms, that if they wanted to address the problem of Earth, they should send whoever they considered their absolute worst. He wanted conquest because conquest was a problem that needed solving on terms that Mark controlled, rather than terms that conquest chose. Conquest came. Mark held his ground long enough, precisely long enough, not a second more, and at the exact moment, the signal went to Angstrom, and the portal opened and conquest went through it, into a dimension that contained nothing except conquest, and whatever conquest did to dimensions that contained nothing. Chicago did not burn. Millions who had died in the original timeline went home that night to their families, to their ordinary lives, completely unaware of what had almost happened to all of it. Mark and Oliver found conquest later, in the dimension, together, and finished what had been started, without a city paying the cost of the finishing. The Viltrumite War changed because Mark knew about the ambush, and knowing meant they did not walk into the location of a trap, they walked into the location of a trap before the trap existed and made the location safe. They arrived at the coalition, in the dominant position, and Mark did not wait. He and Nolan and Thetis flew through the core of Viltrum and the planet that had been the center of everything the Viltrumite Empire was, became pieces, and Thragg became what Thragg became when the thing he had organized his entire existence around was removed from existence. Front of him he blitzed. Thetis was gone instantly because when Thragg decided something was going to be gone, it was gone. He turned to Nolan, and Mark stepped between them. Not the Mark of the first timeline, not the Mark who had reached this moment, broken, after years of being asked for more than he had left to give, this Mark who had lived all of that, and had been given the time to prepare for this moment, with the full knowledge of what it required. He parried, he held, and then he said the thing that changed the battle, without single additional strike. Nolan is Argyl's true heir, royal blood, the one thing the Viltrumite culture had built everything else around. The surviving army turned, not because Mark asked them to, because their own values demanded it, and Mark had known they would, because 500 years was long enough to understand exactly what people chose. When the choice was clear enough, he brought the remaining Viltrumites to Earth, not as occupiers, as a people who needed somewhere to become something other than what they had been for longer than most civilizations had existed. Robot stayed grounded because the people who would have checked him were present. To check him, the Scourge virus became a conversation instead of a catastrophe because Mark had the conversation before the catastrophe became available. Annissa's assault never happened because Annissa had been shown before the showing was too late that it was not going to happen. Marky was never born, and the specific grief of that existence was never added to the weight that the world carried. Eve gave birth to Terra with Mark beside her, the whole time for the first time, without the crises, without the absence, without the specific cost of being the person the universe called when it needed something done, regardless of what that cost. The person it called, he was there, simply there. And Terra arrived into a world that was ready for her for the first time in any version of the story. Thragg came back because Thragg always came back. That was the specific thing about someone who had built their entire identity around being the thing that did not fall. Battle Beast met him, and the fight was everything it was supposed to be. Days of the most complete expression of what two beings who existed for violence could produce. When they were finally given an opponent equal to what they were, Battle Beast died in the fullest possible expression of what he had always been and left Thragg broken, walking toward an ambush he did not know was waiting. Oliver was there. The Oliver that Mark had spent years building, from the raw material of what Oliver actually was, rather than what circumstance had made of him in the original timeline. Alan was there, with the specific power of someone who had survived his own impossible thing and had come out the other side, upgraded. They lit up the sky, and then Emperor Mark arrived. And the sky changed in the specific way that skies changed when the person arriving in them had already been here, had already done this, and knew every move before the move existed. The Viltrumites on Earth watched from their homes with their hybrid children beside them, children who had grown up knowing something other than conquest and made a choice that Thragg had always told them was not available to Viltrumites. They turned mid-battle, and Thragg's empire shattered in real time, not at the hands of his enemies, at the hands of his own people, who had become something he no longer recognized as his. Mark hit Thragg with the words, the same way he had hit Nolan years before in a different fight. That had also been about the same thing. The empire falls anyway. The conquest was always a dead end. The strongest thing has never been the thing that crushed everything else. It has always been the thing that chose not to and could. Thragg laughed until the bones broke and the laughing stopped. Eve upgraded them when the cheap shot landed. That was supposed to end Oliver. She rebuilt them at the level below atoms, at the level where the question of what a body was capable of was answered not by biology, but by the specific genius of someone who understood matter better than matter understood itself. Viltrumite biology plus Eve produced something that had no name in any language, that had tried to describe what power looked like. At its upper limit, it was over. Mark took Thragg to the sun, not for the symbol of it, for the practicality, because a sun was the one location where the ending did not require a city to absorb the cost. They fought in the heart of a star, two beings at the absolute edge of what existed. On the far side of biology, and Thragg screamed, and broke, and kept going, because that was Thragg, that was always Thragg, until it wasn't, until the kept going ran into the wall. Of someone who had been here before, who was completely calm, with the specific calm, of someone doing the work of making an ending happen, that had needed to happen for a very long time. Thragg died in the center of a star, alone, with nothing, no empire, no army, no one watching, just the silence. That came after all of it was gone. Nolan came home for real. To Debbie, who had waited in the specific way that people waited when waiting was the only thing available, and who had made her decision about what she was willing to accept. On the other side of the waiting, Oliver stayed, Earth's guardian, when Mark needed to be something other than Earth's guardian. Tara grew up in a home that was stable, in a world that was trying, genuinely, to be better than what it had been. The hybrid children grew up stronger than either parent species and raised with the values of a world that had decided what it wanted to be. Robot never became a dictator because the people who would have prevented it were alive to prevent it. The Guardians became what they had always been capable of becoming when they were not being used as pieces in a game larger than any of them had signed up for. Mark sat on the roof one night, the same roof, in the same city, under the same sky, that he had sat under in another version of everything. Eve was inside. He could hear her with Tara, the specific sound of an ordinary evening. In a home that was actually a home, he sat with the quiet, not the absence of noise, the presence of something that only quiet produced when everything that had been making noise had been resolved. He had not become invincible, because no one could hurt him. That had never been what invincible meant, not the real version, not the version that 500 years had taught him in the only way that certain lessons could be taught, which was through the paying of them in full. He had become invincible because the people he loved did not have to hurt anymore, not for him, not because of him, not in any of the ways that the original timeline had required them to hurt. That was the version that mattered. That was the version he had come back for. The sky above him was the same sky it had always been, and he was in it, simply present, without something coming for the first time in 500 years, plus however many more it had taken to get here, simply here in a night that was just a night and required nothing from him except to be in it, which was, as it turned out, the most valuable things the universe had ever given him, and the one thing he had never in any version of any timeline taken for granted again.